On February 24th, 2022, at 5:30 a.m. Moscow time, Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation, and within minutes, explosions were reported across Ukraine and sirens began in major cities. But the strangest part of that day was the question being asked everywhere: why would Vladimir Putin do this? Now, for months, Putin had offered explanations that sounded negotiable. He blamed NATO, he talked about defeating fascism, and he framed it as a border security matter. But none of these things require a full scale invasion. But the decision to invade had been made well in advance. We saw the satellite imagery showing new staging areas with nearly 200,000 Russian soldiers positioned near Ukraine. U.S. intelligence reported blood supplies and medical materials moving closer to Ukraine. Reports indicated bridging activity near the Pripyat corridor in Belarus. And that's what it looks like right before a launch, not a negotiation. But even then, leaders still try to reverse it with talk. We saw the French and German leaders reaching out to Putin, seeking to find an off-ramp. The White House, it warned that the invasion of Ukraine was imminent, but at the same time, it refused to give Ukraine weapons, fearing that would lead to escalation. But that fear is exactly what Moscow had counted on. It would counted on the West not being ready to actually help Ukraine. Could the war, though, have been stopped as late as January or February 2022? No, because by February 2022, that was simply the execution date, not the decision date. But there's a more fundamental reason why the war was already set to go, and that's because Vladimir Putin believes that he is fighting a global war, in which Ukraine is merely a battle. He believes that he is engaged in a war against the Western order, its alliances, and what he calls its proxies. If that is the war, meaning for him means breaking Western will. And today, Vladimir Putin is quite certain that he is winning this war. Winning to him means forcing Ukraine to accept the outcomes that Moscow demands, but more importantly, getting the West to assist him in doing so. My name is Dr. Jason Smart. I'm a Kyiv-based National Security Advisor and a Kyiv Post special correspondent. In Vladimir Putin's eyes, World War III was the Cold War. It was the war that he fought in, and the war that the USSR lost when it imploded. But this is why today, this war did not start in 2022. Back in 2007, at the Munich Security Conference, Vladimir Putin named who he was fighting against. He attacked the global order. He described the unipolar world as one center of authority, one center of force, and one center of decision-making, in which he means that Washington and NATO set the security rules, democracy expands, and authoritarianism gets squeezed. But NATO is only part of it. Vladimir Putin opposes a world where leaders are held accountable for what they do. Accountability is the autocrat's nightmare. And that gets to the real driver of all of this. The Western order threatens Vladimir Putin's business model. Vladimir Putin, after leaving the KGB, he was working in St. Petersburg in the mayor's office, and that's where he began working with organized crime in Russia. But rule of law is an existential threat to how Vladimir Putin and his sorts of friends survive. So even today, people still miss what drives Putin. They treat his actions as something about a border dispute. They miss that he believes that he's waging a war against us. So help us get out the truth of what Russia is really up to by liking this video, sharing it with others, and hyping it, and help us reach 275,000 subscribers by subscribing now and consider becoming a channel member today. So Vladimir Putin learned a simple lesson when he was dealing with the Mafia, and that's that the threat of violence usually will get you what you want. In most situations, a broken window is enough to extract compliance. By August 2008, Vladimir Putin was already an expert in this, and that's when he invaded Georgia. The world was fixated on what was going on in the Beijing Olympics. Though there was a ceasefire in the end, Vladimir Putin faced no real consequences, no strategic reversal. He saw for his own eyes that forces on the ground create facts, and the world will accept them in order to avoid escalation. Vladimir Putin then moved further. He seized Crimea and the Donbass in 2021. And of course, this did trigger sanctions. But the territorial gains, they stayed in Russia's possession. The lesson was very clear. Punishment is tolerable, and gains, though, they can be permanent. A year later, Russia demonstrated multi-theater leverage by intervening in Syria. As thousands of Syrians died and millions fled, Putin watched Western red lines evaporate. He learned that fear of escalation often beats enforcement. In his mind, diplomacy without consequences is just paperwork. Having tested this a few times, by 2021, Vladimir Putin had refined the simple method: threaten force, and the West most often will yield. And that perfectly aligns with what Sun Tzu said, that the greatest victory is that which requires no battle. He also foreshadowed, though, his next steps. He published a text denying Ukraine's separate nationhood. He framed Ukraine's sovereignty as being a Western project. That Ukraine was a Western proxy. And that signaled very clearly what he thought needed to be done. Now, from Moscow's view, the pattern looks reliable. The West declares red lines, but then it avoids force. Russia, threats can produce gains, and those gains can be kept. So each escalation, it must aim to go higher, because fear, it keeps paying off. And this approach has been applied across the world now for years by Russia. And these are not isolated incidences. These are all part of a strategy. These are how today Russia believes it is beating NATO in a war. Now, the Kremlin mindset is also rooted, though, in a trauma that's important to note. World War II, it killed roughly 26 million Soviet citizens. So after 1945, the state, when it was rebuilding, had a very clear realization: it would be impossible to wage another world war. That war could wipe Russia off the map forever. So Moscow learned to avoid direct, decisive wars. Ideology demands expansion. The communist ideology will not allow you just to sit there and keep it to yourself. You have to ignite the global revolution. But the solution to that is to go for a quieter war, in the shadows, to extract concessions. The trick is to get the West to fight the wrong war. And that's why today, the Cold War, we see how it played out for Russia versus the West. Consider this. From 1948 to the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States spent about $27 trillion in current USD. What's amazing about that is that is about 2 times America's 1991 GDP. It's also about 180 times Russia's current annual military budget. So obviously, we were far outspending the Russians. And that's because the Russians knew that they could not compete with us in a normal hot war. They were fighting a different sort of war, a war for which we were not even preparing. But there's something else that's very important here. The lesson that we see that the Russians seek for is that they must always have leverage. Pressure comes from timing, from risk, from heavy nerves, and the target is political fear within democratic societies. How to get hesitation from Western leaders. Dictatorships are more insulated from these sorts of pressures because they don't have to worry what the voters think. The press will not criticize them. And that is why Moscow avoids direct engagement with NATO. It aims to win what it wants without actually going into a physical battle. As Mao Zedong used to put it, the enemy is strong and we are weak, and we must avoid decisive engagement with a superior force. Look at the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The weaker side was able to get what it wanted. In 1962, the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, and the U.S., it became quite worried. The Soviets gambled big that Kennedy would blink, and sure enough, within a short period of time, there was a deal that was reached. Kennedy did not blink, but the Soviets got what they wanted. The U.S.'s missiles in Turkey, the Jupiters, they were pulled out a short time later. So a smaller economy can still build outsized reach. It targets politics and perception instead of matching Western military production. And that is how a weaker Soviet economy can expand its patron client map. Look how across the world the Soviet Union was quite successful. There were revolutions on every continent, and that was a country that was economically far, far smaller than the Western countries when united. But the KGB, they turned that logic into a system. Prioritize influence and outcomes without decisive battles. Use active measures, disinformation, front groups, provocations, and division stoking. The West struggles to respond because it is expecting to fight the last war. It's expecting something like World War II. But today, the wrapper is newer of how Russia does this, but the logic is essentially the same. It's often called the Gerasimov Doctrine. It reflects Russia's modern approach to war and influence, and it's associated with the current head of the Russian military, Vladimir Gerasimov. So if this is in fact the doctrine of the Russian military, perhaps we should pay attention to it. One of the key attributes of this is that Russia seeks to find where there is cohesion in Western societies and to break it. But more than that is to look for where there is already tension. In democracies, if they're not united, they cannot sustain a long fight. So you look for where there's economic inequality, racial and religious friction, ideological divisions, and you, quote, lean on the fissures, as Che Guevara used to recommend. But Che, like Putin, he never would have anticipated something that Ukraine has on its side. And those are drones. And you can help the Ukrainians get more of them. Please see the first pinned comment below with the question of the day and a video you should check out. But right below them, you'll see how you too can donate and help the Ukrainians get what they need to win. All donations right now are being matched by a very generous donor. Thank you. So Ukraine's military is the opposite of Moscow's preferred game. It can fight and it can hold on. Putin did not anticipate his 3-day special military operation turning to a 4-year war. But Russia, it began this, I'll remember, with the idea of decapitating the Russian state, airborne and special operations raids aimed at rapid political collapse. But when that blitz failed, the strategy simply shifted. Today, Vladimir Putin does not believe he is losing. He defines winning as forcing a political outcome, not racing for land. He does not see slow battlefield movement as decisive failure. The battlefield reality is slow, but it still produces a durable occupation map. Russia today holds about 19% of Ukraine. That's roughly the size of the state of Ohio. The CSIS describes gains for Russia of being about 15 to 70 meters per day. That's 49 feet to 230 feet per day. The human cost does not change the plan for Vladimir Putin. Russia has suffered about 1.2 million casualties in just 4 years, and all of them were absorbed without changing course. That works out to about 102 casualties per square kilometer. That's 264 per square mile. As Ho Chi Minh warned in 1946, you can kill 10 of my men for every one that I kill of yours. But even at those odds, you will lose and I will win. Because rapid conquest is not happening. Moscow, it leans on coercion. The aim is to push the West to pressure Ukraine to give up territory. The pitch is escalation fear. So surrender gets sold as de-escalation. The Soviet-owned tool is reflexive control, shaping the opponent's choices. Russia believes that it can get the West to force Ukraine to give up territory. The West will cooperate directly with Russia's plans. But if Russia succeeds, if it is able to gain more territory, it gains certainty that the West will fold under threat, and that lesson will be applied far beyond Ukraine. And here's something you should check out. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.